I'll be presenting preliminary results from our UV study. If you've joined last year's event or looked at Thomas's presentation, some of this might feel redundant, but there's some few interesting things that we figured out so far. Just to give a quick recap, we wanted to do the effects of UV radiation on slackline webbing. And to do this, we needed to find a good location where we had lots of sun and not so much influence from other types of weather. So naturally, we went to the highest building in Switzerland, maybe in Europe. And there they have weather monitoring systems that we can use to gather data on how strong exactly the radiation is and compare that to radiation levels in other locations and therefore draw conclusions that should be applicable worldwide, even though we only measured in one specific location. The next step was to gather some money and get the be allowed to go up there, which thankfully Thomas did lots of phone calls, maybe hundreds of hours, went into just getting this legitimately underway, which ultimately resulted in Thomas and myself going up there and finding a suitable location. And we got lucky and found this sort of south-facing wall that had some ravine protection netting that we could anchor our slacklines to. The next step was to design and build some of the frames that we were using. In the end, we decided to make them out of wood because one, it was really cheap and easy to build, and two, if there was an avalanche or some other severe weather event and they were to be lost on the glacier, it would reduce the environmental impact if they were made of wood instead of maybe metal or plastic. So afterwards, we went up with a small train and a bunch of different webbings. Here you can see 3 frames mounted. 2 weeks later, we mounted a 4th frame just on top. And overall, we had 10 different time frames to test. So I would start with 0 exposure all the way up to 1.5 years of exposure, which we'll collect very soon. And for each time frame, we have 3 samples of, I think, 7 different webbings. So that's what you can see here with the coloration. So it goes from blue and repeats all the time. So these are all the different samples that we collected. Now, unfortunately, we did lose 1 frame to an avalanche last winter. Someone actually did recover it a couple 100 meters down the glacier. We'll try to figure out if we can use that for any good test results or if we just scrap that one from the data. Now, so far we've tested, I think, 8 different samples, and the results that we've gotten so far are, well, not super conclusive to all the questions that we want to answer, but we're still waiting for quite a few of the more long-term exposures. So what we can say so far from the data that we have is that, curiously, all of the nylon webbings break at a higher strength than they were without any exposure. So leaving out the webbing for 2 weeks apparently made it stronger. I'm not sure how to explain this, but having a 3, 4, 5% increase of strength across all the webbings and all the samples seems to be not random. So we'll try to see if there's any maybe sort of settling of the fibers going on, similar to the one that was described with the Dyneema, or if it's really just random, we have to, or the humidity that helps settling the fibers. But in the end, the strength increase is very little, so let's just leave it at that. Then, very significantly for everyone who is slacklining, polyester webbing ages very, very quickly within the first 2 months. So after 4 weeks, some of the polyester webbings had a more than 20% decrease in strength compared to new. So that would mean you only have like 30, 40 days outside before you have a significant reduction in strength in your polyester webbing. Whereas your nylon webbings, so the polyamide webbings, they lose their strength in a more linear fashion. So a basically new nylon webbing will still be new or test or break the same way as if it were new for the first 2, 4, 5, 6 months of exposure. So that means 100, 120, 180 days outside, whereas polyester webbing will lose a significant amount of their strength within a couple of weeks of being outside. So for everyone who has lines that are outside very often, perma rigs or lines for competitions or training, even festivals, don't expect to have all of the strength left only because the webbing was only set up like a couple of weeks ago. Then, at least with our method of break testing the webbing, the standard deviation does not increase with UV exposure. So as webbing ages, for now we've only had like naturally aged webbing that was also used or slacklined on or just outside in the wind and the elements, but only UV radiation does not increase the standard deviation, whereas use does. So if you have, for example, if you test a slackline that has been rigged as a permaline for 60 or 70 days, the ends or the parts of the slackline that have seen the most use will break at a lower strength than maybe the end that was not walked that often, or maybe the middle that has been underneath a protective sheath if you have a freestyle setup. But the UV exposure alone does not, or does very evenly affect the webbings, which also probably is a good indication that our test results are somewhat reliable if we test only 3 samples. And then at least in the timeframes that we've tested so far, so up to 300 days outside, it doesn't look like the more complex webbing structures like the kern mantle constructions or the triple or quadruple layers of webbing add anything in terms of UV resistance. So they may be better for abrasion, or they may be better for just normal weathering, but in terms of UV resistance, it doesn't make a difference if you have a tubular webbing, if you have a flat webbing, or if you have a kern mantle construction. All webbing ages the same way, as far as we can tell. Maybe there's a different drop-off in the end after 1 or 2 years, but we don't have that data yet. So for now, it doesn't look like a kern mantle construction really has any benefit in terms of UV resistance. Then UV damage is not necessarily visible. That is especially true at the very beginning. So some of the polyester samples broke 30% lower than their initial breaking strength, but you couldn't distinguish them from the new samples. So even a sample that is basically brand new feels and looks the same as one that's been outside for 2 or 3 months. And there's a significant difference in strength that you won't be able to tell just from looking at it. After half a year of exposure, most of the colors fade and the webbing becomes sort of stiff and brittle, and it feels like the surface coating has worn off or has been shown away or radiated away from the UV. But especially for polyester, the initial degradation is basically indetectable just from like a haptic or a visual inspection. And lastly, most importantly maybe, we now know that old webbings can break just from being old. So if you have older pieces of webbing, especially maybe webbing that has a low break strength to begin with, like 20, 25 kilonewton, tubular nylon especially, will break eventually if you just keep using it normally. So we had two instances of a mainline failing because of old webbing, essentially. So if you're using your webbing for freestyle or if you're using your webbing for permalines, make sure that after a certain amount of time, as recommended by the manufacturer, or at least after 180 or 360 days outside, it is time to retire that webbing. And don't retire it in a way that, okay, I can still use this as a backup, or I can still use this for a long line. Retire it and scrap it. Like maybe make some ornamental space net kind of stuff for your back garden or something, or just make belts or some memorial slackline decorations, but make sure it's not used anymore. Because even just a small park line breaking can lead to like significant injuries. So it's not worth using your older webbings for maybe not so safety critical stuff. Just retire it completely. It's not so expensive that you want to kill someone over it, right? And that's it for the UV study part. So maybe now is a good time to answer some questions if there have been any concerning the UV study so far. Otherwise, I'll just talk very quickly about the highline rescues.
Does anybody have any questions? I think the fact that like the UV damage not necessarily indicating in color and the webbing appearance is really interesting. Kind of concerning for polyester webbing.
Yeah. Laurent's saying something, but I can't hear him.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yes, I have a question about the fact that UV degrades more polyester webbing than polyamide webbing. It's only because it's not intention, like it's not tensioned webbing. What about the fact that maybe combined with tension, we will have the opposite? Yeah, I was asking if here the webbing is not tensioned. It's not tensioned webbing. So we see that polyester degrades faster at first than polyamide. But if the webbing was tensioned, maybe we will see the opposite. I don't know. It's just we can say that polyester degrades faster. I mean, for permarics.
Yeah. So we've looked at some other research on fibers in general and rope specifically, and it looks like, but I can't confirm this for the webbing so far, that nylon fibers degrade sort of in a linear fashion. So the more days outside, the weaker the webbing is. Whereas the polyester fibers degrade more on a logarithmic curve. So at the beginning, there's a very sharp decrease in strength, and it sort of levels out. So once we publish the data, you're going to see that in the first 4 months, the polyester is sort of weaker than the polyamide webbings, and then the decrease gets slower and slower and slower, and by 180 days, it almost stopped. So at some point, the polyester webbing doesn't get weaker, which is, I guess, in a sense, you could compare it to cyclic loading and steel versus aluminum, so that in this reference, it would be that the polyester webbing is the steel, which sort of stops losing strength at some point, whereas the polyamide webbing would be more akin to aluminum, which suffers until failure, basically.
So Laurent's question was also around, can you mute yourself? It was also around like the difference in tension versus not tensioned, right?
Yeah. So yes, of course, all the samples in the frames are basically untensioned or at most hand tensioned. And if you have a permaline rigged on polyester, it will have maybe half a kilonewton of standing tension, whereas a permaline rigged, I don't know, for freestyle on nylon would have maybe 3 kilonewton standing tension. So there might be a difference in how that ages. But I'm not sure if that influence is strong enough to override the aging characteristics of the material themselves, the materials themselves. So maybe we can try to set up tension lines up there, but yeah, it's going to be difficult either way. So I can't answer that question.
Yeah, of course, but yeah, it's interesting that you think it will not really matter, because sometimes when you look at different parameters, but like one parameter at a time, and then when you combine two, you have different results. Like if you have the same tension on the polyester and polyamide, and you also look at the UV, maybe at first without tension you will have a bigger decrease in polyester, and then a bigger decrease in the polyamide with the tension. It's but yeah, it was more about that, but I don't know, of course.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but there have been tests on like permalines that have been up, like nylon permalines, and they seem to conform with what we've seen so far. I think there's like theoretically maybe the difference in tension makes it so that the fibers are compressed or stretched. But it also seems like the UV doesn't penetrate past a certain amount either. So I don't, so theoretically there's like maybe one way yes, but then it's counteracted by like other theoretical things that we haven't tested as well.